Miss Marple and the case Inspector Slack dismissed. Good evening and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I want to start by thanking you from the heart. Your support and presence here make this journey truly special. Preparing these mysteries is a labor of love, and it's so rewarding to see how many of you find comfort and delight in them. Our cozy community keeps growing, and that's thanks to you. If you'd like to help us share even more timeless stories, please remember to subscribe. Now let's settle in and drift together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Whist and Hot Dishes. The Blue Boar in St. Mary Mead had seen many evenings of parish entertainment, but few quite so bustling as this particular May evening in 1955. The ancient inn, with its low black beams and mullioned windows, fairly hummed with activity. Upstairs in the long room that served for village functions, the monthly whist drive was in full swing, while below in the kitchen, a symphony of culinary preparation was being conducted with military precision. Miss Jane Marple, seated at table 3 with her usual partner, Mrs. Dolly Bantry of Gossington Hall, laid down the 7 of hearts with a gentle smile. "I do so enjoy these parish evenings," she murmured, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar faces around them. "There's something so illuminating about observing people at their leisure, don't you think, Dolly?" Lady Bantry, resplendent in her best purple silk, despite the informality of the occasion, snorted delicately. Illuminating is one word for it. I'd call it downright revealing. Look at Colonel Melchett over there, pretending he hasn't been peeking at Mrs. Weatherby's cards for the past 10 minutes. The room was warm with the press of bodies and the May evening air that drifted through the opened casements. Perhaps 40 souls were gathered for the drive, ranging from the stalwart ladies of the Women's Institute to the more reluctant husbands dragged along for the sake of parish unity. The Reverend Leonard Clement moved between the tables with his usual gentle authority, while his wife Griselda dispensed tea and encouragement in equal measure. At the far end of the room, near the service hatch that connected to the kitchen below, stood the evening's most unwelcome guest, Mr. Percy Nash. The county licensing officer was a man of middle years and considerable self-importance, his small eyes darting about the room with the sharp attention of a bird of prey. He had arrived uninvited at 7:30, declaring with false joviality that he simply couldn't resist dropping in to see how the good people of St. Mary Mead entertained themselves. Nobody was fooled by this Bantry. Percy Nash was feared throughout the county for his surprise inspections and his talent for discovering minute infractions of licensing regulations. More than one publican had found himself facing substantial fines, or worse, the threat of closure after one of Nash's friendly visits. "Nasty little man," Lady Bantry observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Paul Cartwright looks positively green around the gills. Can't say I blame him." Indeed, Paul Cartwright, the Blue Boar's jovial landlord, was displaying none of his usual bonhomie this evening. A large man with a red face and thinning hair, he normally dominated any room he entered with his booming voice and expansive gestures. Tonight, however, he hovered nervously near the bar, his eyes never straying far from the unwelcome figure of Nash. "Paul's always been one to sail close to the wind," Miss Marple observed quietly. "I remember my dear nephew Raymond mentioning something about the licensing laws becoming quite strict lately." The service hatch beside their table gave a sudden clatter, and up came the dumb waiter bearing plates of shepherd's pie, fragrant and steaming. Vera Cartwright, Paul's wife, appeared at the hatch with her usual brisk efficiency. She was a thin, neat woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back severely, and an air of perpetual motion about her. Where her husband was all bluster and expansive gesture, Vera was all sharp angles and practical competence. "There we are," she announced, beginning to distribute the plates. "Mavis has outdone herself tonight. The lamb was particularly fine, and she's done those lovely crispy potatoes just the way you like them. Dr. Haydock." Dr. Mr. Haydock, a comfortable man with a gray beard and twinkling eyes, accepted his plate with evident pleasure. "Excellent as always, Mrs. Cartwright. You're fortunate to have such a treasure in your kitchen." Vera's smile was tight. "Indeed we are. Mavis Reed has been with us 3 years now, and I don't know what we'd do without her." Miss Marple had encountered Mavis Reed on several occasions and had formed a favorable impression of the quiet, competent woman who served as the Blue Boar's cook. She was a widow in her late 30s with dark hair and steady brown eyes, possessed of that particular stillness that comes to those who have learned to find peace in useful work. As Vera moved away to serve other tables, Miss Marple noticed something that struck her as oddly out of place. Beside the dumbwaiter hatch on the wide windowsill sat a small white saucer. Upon it was a wooden clothes peg, the sort used for hanging washing on the line. It seemed a curious thing to find in such a location, as if it had been set down hastily by someone whose attention had been called elsewhere. "I say, this is excellent pie," Lady Bantry declared, attacking her portion with enthusiasm. "That cook of theirs really is a find." From the kitchen below came the rhythmic sounds of culinary activity, the clatter of pans, the rush of water, the steady thump of a cleaver against a chopping board. The dumbwaiter continued its loyal service, carrying empty plates down and laden ones up, operated by a system of ropes and pulley that had served the Blue Boar for the better part of a century. The interval between the first and second halves of the whist arrived with its usual pleasant confusion. Players stretched, sought refreshment, and engaged in the sort of gentle gossip that forms the lifeblood of village society. Nash, Miss Marple observed, had positioned himself near the refreshment table, where he could overhear the maximum number of conversations. It was then that he made his fateful announcement. His voice, pitched to carry but disguised as casual conversation, reached every corner of the room. "Quite a cozy establishment you have here. Cartwright," he said, accepting a cup of tea from Vera's hands. "Very comfortable, of course. Comfort and compliance don't always go hand in hand, do they? I shouldn't be surprised if after tonight certain houses in this area find themselves, shall we say, smarting a bit." The threat was unmistakable, though wrapped in the bland language of officialdom. Miss Marple saw Paul Cartwright's face flush even redder, while Vera's hand trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. Below stairs, the dumbwaiter gave another clatter. Vera glanced toward the hatch with something that might have been annoyance. "I do hope Mavis hasn't forgotten the soup for the chairman's table," she murmured. "Mr. Clement specifically requested it." Miss Marple, rising to refill her teacup, found herself once again near the service hatch. The curious saucer was still there with its incongruous clothes peg. As she waited her turn at the teapot, she couldn't help but wonder what domestic purpose could have brought such an item to such a place. The evening air stirred through the opened windows, carrying with it the scent of May blossom and the distant sound of the village church clock beginning to strike 9. In a quarter of an hour, the second half of the whist drive would begin, and the pleasant routine of village life would continue its familiar course. Or so everyone believed. Chapter 2. A Fall in the Shaft. The second half of the whist drive had barely begun when the scream shattered the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft shuffle of cards. It came from below, a woman's voice raised in shock and horror, followed immediately by the crash of crockery and a man's startled oath. Miss Marple, who had just taken her seat for the final rubber, felt her blood chill at the sound. In her long experience of village life, she had learned to distinguish between the various cries that punctuated ordinary existence: the shriek of delight at good news, the wail of genuine distress, the theatrical exclamation designed to draw attention. This was none of those. This was the involuntary sound torn from someone who had witnessed something dreadful. "Good heavens!" Lady Bantry exclaimed, her cards scattering to the floor. "Whatever was that?" Around the room, conversations died and heads turned toward the service hatch. The Reverend Clement rose from his position at the chairman's table, his mild face creased with concern. Perhaps someone should... Another voice interrupted from below. Male this time raised in urgent command. "Don't touch him." Nobody touch anything. "Send for Dr. Haydock at once." This second voice Miss Marple recognized as belonging to Len Bidd, the Blue Boar's cellar man, a lanky fellow with prematurely graying hair and fingers permanently stained yellow from his excessive smoking habit. Dr. Haydock was already moving toward the stairs, his medical bag mysteriously appearing in his hand as if by magic. Several of the gentlemen followed, including Colonel Melchett and, somewhat to Miss Marple's surprise, Inspector Slack, who had been enjoying an off-duty pint in the public bar below. "Jane," Lady Bantry whispered urgently. "We simply must go and see what's happened." Miss Marple nodded, though her expression remained troubled. That scream had contained a note of genuine terror, and in her experience, such reactions were rarely prompted by minor accidents. They made their way carefully down the narrow stairs, Lady Bantry's heels tapping against the worn oak steps. The scene that greeted them in the kitchen was one of controlled chaos. Percy Nash lay crumpled at the bottom of the dumbwaiter shaft, his small body twisted at an unnatural angle, his head turned at a degree that spoke eloquently of the severity of his injuries. Above him, the dumbwaiter car had descended to its lowest position, its wooden platform resting perhaps 2 feet above the fallen man's body. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the still form, his practiced fingers moving with gentle efficiency. After a moment, he looked up and shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. The skull fracture is quite severe." Inspector Slack, a thin, sour-faced man with a permanently skeptical expression, stood examining the dumbwaiter mechanism. He was out of uniform this evening, wearing a brown suit that had seen better days, but his manner retained all the authority of his position. "Accident, plain and simple," he announced with the air of one who would brook no contradiction. The holding ropes frayed clean through. Must have given way just as Nash was leaning in to have a look at something. Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with the peculiar intensity that had served her so well in past mysteries. The kitchen was a model of efficiency, with copper pots gleaming on their hooks, and everything in its proper place, except for the tragedy that had occurred in its midst. Vera Cartwright stood pressed against the far wall, her face pale but her manner admirably controlled. "I heard the crash," she was explaining to Inspector Slack. "I was just coming back from upstairs when I heard Mavis scream. Poor woman, what a dreadful shock for her." Mavis Reed stood near the scullery door, her dark hair slightly disheveled. Her apron was twisted as if she'd been working energetically when the accident occurred. Her brown eyes were wide with shock, but she seemed to be recovering her composure with admirable speed. "I was washing up the soup tureens," she explained in her quiet voice. "I heard a sort of creaking sound and then a terrible crash. When I looked, I saw—" She gestured helplessly toward the shaft. "Natural enough," Inspector Slack said briskly. "These old rope systems wear out. Should have been replaced years ago, I shouldn't wonder. Dangerous, really, to let them get into such a state." Paul Cartwright had appeared from somewhere, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Relief at Nash's removal from the scene of his operations warred visibly with horror at the manner of that removal and concern for his establishment's reputation. "Terrible thing," he kept repeating. "Terrible accident. Poor fellow. Though I must say he shouldn't have been poking about down here without permission. Health and safety, you know." Miss Marple, while listening to these exchanges, found herself drawn to examine the dumbwaiter shaft itself. The mechanism was indeed old, as Inspector Slack had observed, but it showed signs of careful maintenance. The ropes appeared to be in good condition, save for the one that had allegedly frayed. She moved closer to the hatch, her keen eyes taking in details that others might have missed. The wooden sill of the service opening was smooth with age and use, polished by countless hands and the passage of innumerable plates and dishes. As she ran her finger along the edge, something made her pause. There, caught on a slight splinter in the wood, was a tiny fragment of something that definitely did not belong. It appeared to be a thread, but one that had been subjected to heat. The end was not frayed or torn, but rather fused, as if it had been burned through. More curious still was the faint but unmistakable scent that seemed to hang in the air near the shaft. It was delicate, almost feminine, lavender hair oil if she was not mistaken, an odd fragrance to encounter in a kitchen, and particularly odd to find it lingering in the vicinity of what was supposed to have been a simple mechanical failure. Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary examination. "Head injury consistent with a heavy blow," he announced. The poor fellow would have struck the side of the shaft as he fell, then hit the stone floor. Death would have been instantaneous, merciful, at least the Reverend Clement observed, having descended to offer what comfort he could, though one cannot help but feel that Mr. Nash brought this upon himself through his own curiosity. Inspector Slack was already preparing to have the body removed. "Clear case of misadventure," he declared. "I'll need statements from everyone who was present, of course, but I don't anticipate any complications. These old buildings are death traps, really. Surprised this sort of thing doesn't happen more often." Miss Marple continued her quiet observation, noting the precise position of everything in the kitchen. The cleanliness was exemplary, she observed, almost aggressively so. Every surface gleamed, every utensil was in its designated place. It was the kitchen of someone who took enormous pride in order and efficiency. Yet there were small anomalies. A damp patch on the floor near the flour bin suggested something had been hastily cleaned up. The range showed signs of recent heavy use, though the evening's cooking should have been largely completed by now. And there, partially hidden behind a large mixing bowl, was what appeared to be a short length of kitchen twine, with one end showing that same peculiar fused appearance she had noticed on the thread caught in the hatch. "Most distressing," she murmured to Lady Bantry as they made their way back upstairs, leaving the officials to their grim work. "Though I must confess, Dolly, that something about the whole affair strikes me as irregular." "Irregular?" Lady Bantry raised her eyebrows. "How do you mean?" "Well," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "ropes do fray, certainly, but in my experience they tend to chafe and wear gradually. They don't simply melt." Above them, the whist drive had effectively ended, the players standing about in small groups, discussing the tragedy in hushed tones. The pleasant village evening had taken a decidedly sinister turn, and Miss Marple found herself wondering if Inspector Slack's confident pronouncement of accident might prove to be somewhat premature. After all, Percy Nash had made enemies throughout the county with his zealous enforcement of licensing regulations, and the timing of his death, occurring just after his thinly veiled threat to certain houses, seemed rather too convenient to be entirely coincidental. But perhaps she was allowing her imagination to run away with her. Perhaps it truly had been nothing more than a tragic accident, the result of an aging building's inevitable decay. Still, as she retrieved her knitting bag and prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple found herself thinking about that curious scent of lavender and the mysteriously fused thread caught in the hatch. In her experience, when small details refused to fit into the accepted pattern of events, they usually signified that the accepted pattern was incorrect. Time, she reflected, would undoubtedly tell. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Singe and Scent. The following morning found Miss Marple in her garden, ostensibly deadheading her roses, but in reality mulling over the events of the previous evening. The May sunshine was gentle on her face, and the familiar sounds of St. Mary Mead going about its morning business provided a soothing counterpoint to her troubled thoughts. She had slept poorly, her mind returning again and again to that peculiar scene in the Blue Boar's kitchen. Inspector Slack's confident pronouncement of accidental death had been accepted by most of the village with the resigned shrug that accompanies life's occasional tragedies. But Miss Marple found herself unable to dismiss certain small irregularities that continued to nag at her consciousness. "Jane, dear, you look positively pensive this morning." Lady Bantry's voice carried across the garden wall, accompanied by the rustle of her approaching footsteps through the connecting gate. Miss Marple looked up from her roses with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Dolly. Yes, I must confess that last evening's unhappy events have left me rather unsettled." Lady Bantry, resplendent in a morning ensemble of yellow silk that would have been more appropriate for Ascot than a village garden, settled herself on the wooden bench beneath the apple tree. Dreadful business, certainly, though I can't say I'm surprised that Nash came to a bad end eventually. The man made enemies wherever he went. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, snipping a particularly persistent sucker from her maiden's blush. Though one might have expected his downfall to be professional rather than physical. "You're not suggesting," Lady Bantry began, then stopped, her eyes widening. "Jane Marple, you're not thinking this was anything other than an accident, are you?" Miss Marple sat down her secateurs and considered her answer carefully. "I'm thinking, Dolly, that there were certain small details about last evening that don't quite fit the picture Inspector Slack has painted." Before Lady Bantry could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of Dr. Haydock, who was making his rounds through the village. His comfortable figure appeared at the garden gate, his medical bag in one hand, and his walking stick in the other. "Ladies," he greeted them with his usual warmth, though Miss Marple detected a certain gravity beneath his genial manner. "I trust you both slept well after our unfortunate excitement last evening." "As well as could be expected," Miss Marple replied. "Tell me, doctor, have you completed your examination of poor Mr. Nash?" Dr. Haydock's expression grew more serious. "I have indeed. The preliminary findings confirm what I observed at the scene. Severe head trauma consistent with a fall down the dumbwaiter shaft. The skull fracture would have caused immediate unconsciousness followed by death within minutes." "And the cause of the fall?" Lady Bantry inquired. "Inspector Slack maintains it was mechanical failure. The fraying of the holding rope causing the dumb car to descend unexpectedly, striking Nash as he leaned into the shaft." Miss Marple detected a note of reservation in the doctor's voice. "But you have doubts?" Dr. Haydock glanced around, then lowered his voice slightly. "Between ourselves, ladies, I found the pattern of injuries somewhat curious. While entirely consistent with a fall, there were certain aspects that suggested the initial blow might have come from above rather than being sustained during the descent." "You mean he was struck by the descending car before he fell?" Miss Marple asked. "Precisely. Which would suggest he was already leaning well into the shaft when the mechanism failed, rather an odd position to adopt unless he was examining something specific." This information aligned with Miss Marple's own observations, and she felt that familiar prickle of intuition that had served her so well in the past. "Doctor, when you examined the scene, did you notice anything unusual about the kitchen itself?" Dr. Haydock considered the question. "It was remarkably clean, I recall. Mrs. Cartwright keeps an exemplary establishment, though, now that you mention it, there did seem to be some recent activity around the range." "The surface was warmer than I would have expected, given that the evening's cooking should have been completed hours earlier." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. This detail, combined with her own observations, was beginning to form a pattern. "I wonder if I might impose upon you both for a small favor. I find myself rather curious about the exact circumstances of Mr. Nash's death, and I believe a return visit to the Blue Boar might prove illuminating." Lady Bantry's eyes sparkled with interest. An investigation. Jane, I'm always ready for a bit of detective work. Dr. Haydock looked somewhat doubtful. I'm not sure Inspector Slack would appreciate civilian interference in what he considers a straightforward case of accidental death. Oh, we shan't interfere, Miss Marple assured him with a gentle smile. We'll simply be 3 concerned members of the community, expressing our condolences, and perhaps offering assistance to the Cartwrights during this difficult time. An hour later, the unlikely trio made their way along the high street toward the Blue Boar. The inn looked peaceful in the morning sunshine, with no outward sign of the previous evening's tragedy. Paul Cartwright met them at the door, his usual florid complexion somewhat paler than normal. Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, Dr. Haydock, he greeted them with forced joviality. Kind of you to call. Vera's in the kitchen, still a bit shaken by the whole business, as you can imagine. They found Vera Cartwright engaged in what appeared to be an unusually thorough cleaning of the kitchen. Every surface gleamed with fresh scrubbing, and the air was heavy with the scent of carbolic soap and vinegar. She looked up from her work with a strange smile. "How thoughtful of you to come," she said, though Miss Marple detected a note of anxiety beneath the conventional politeness. "I'm afraid we're all rather at 6s and 7s today." Such a shocking thing to happen. Indeed it was, Vera replied, returning to her scrubbing with perhaps more vigor than the task required. Such a steady girl is Mavis, though naturally she's been quite upset. Miss Marple moved casually toward the area near the dumb waiter shaft, ostensibly to offer comfort, but actually to conduct a more thorough examination of the scene. The mechanism itself had been secured by Inspector Slack's men, but the surrounding area remained accessible. It was then that she made her first significant discovery. Beside the large flour bin, partially concealed behind a storage jar, lay a short length of kitchen twine. One end showed clear signs of having been cut with a sharp implement, while the other displayed that same peculiar fused appearance she had noticed the previous evening. More intriguing still was a small dark crescent burned into the stone floor near the base of the range. It was no larger than a thumbnail, easily overlooked amid the general cleaning, but unmistakably the mark left by a burnt match head. As she straightened up, pretending to have been examining the flour bin's contents, Miss Marple caught a faint but distinctive scent lingering in the air near the shaft. It was the same, a delicate fragrance of lavender hair oil she had detected the previous evening, though considerably fainter now after the night's natural dissipation and the morning's energetic cleaning. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said casually, "I couldn't help but notice how spotless everything is. You must have been up very early to achieve such perfect order after last evening's disruption." Vera's hands paused in their scrubbing. "Yes, well, one can't let standards slip, can one, even under such circumstances. Poor Mr. Nash wouldn't have wanted his unfortunate accident to cause lasting disorder." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she privately reflected that the late Mr. Nash would likely have been more concerned with the licensing irregularities. His death had so conveniently prevented him from investigating. Dr. Haydock had been examining the dumb waiter shaft with professional interest. "Remarkable how these old mechanisms function," he observed. "Though I must say the rope system appears to be in better condition than Inspector Slack suggested. The standing part shows normal wear, but hardly what one would call dangerous fraying." Vera's response was perhaps a shade too quick. "Oh, but you know how these things can deteriorate suddenly. One day perfectly sound, the next completely unreliable." Miss Marple stored this exchange away for future consideration, along with her growing collection of small anomalies. The fused twine, the burnt match mark, the lingering scent of lavender, the extraordinary cleanliness of a kitchen that should have shown signs of the previous evening's disruption. Each detail, insignificant in isolation, contributed to a picture that differed markedly from Inspector Slack's confident assessment. As they took their leave, Miss Marple found herself more convinced than ever that Percy Nash's death had been anything but accidental. The question now was not whether murder had been committed, but by whom, and how it had been accomplished with such apparent simplicity. "Dolly," she said quietly as they walked back through the village, "I fear our evening's tragedy was rather more complex than it appeared." Lady Bantry nodded grimly. "You found something, haven't you?" "Several somethings," Miss Marple replied. "And I suspect that when we understand their significance, we shall discover that ropes, as I mentioned last evening, have a tendency not to melt by themselves." Chapter 4. The Saucer by the Flower Bin. Miss Marple's afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of Mavis Read at her cottage door. The Blue Boar's cook stood on the doorstep, her usually composed features marked by strain and an obvious struggle with some internal conflict. "Miss Marple," she began hesitantly, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I find myself in need of, that is, I wondered if I might have a word." "Of course." Miss Marple led her visitor into the sitting room and settled her in the most comfortable chair. "You've had a dreadful shock. Would you care for some tea?" Mavis shook her head, her work-roughened hands twisting in her lap. "You were very kind yesterday morning, you and Lady Bantry and Dr. Haydock. Not everyone has been so understanding." Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, sensing that the young woman needed time to gather her thoughts. The village can be harsh in its judgment sometimes. People fear what they don't understand. "It's not that," Mavis said quickly. "Well, not entirely. It's Inspector Slack. He's been asking questions, and some of his questions seem to suggest—" She trailed off, unable to voice her fears. "That perhaps Mr. Nash's death was not the simple accident he proclaimed it to be?" Miss Marple suggested gently. Mavis's eyes widened. "You've thought so, too. I was beginning to wonder if I was going mad. There were things about last evening that didn't seem right, but when the inspector was so certain—" Miss Marple sat down her knitting and gave the younger woman her full attention. "What sort of things, my dear?" "Well, to begin with, that saucer by the service hatch, the one with the clothes peg on it. I noticed it during the interval just before—" Mavis shuddered. "It wasn't mine. I keep my pegs in the scullery, and I certainly wouldn't leave one lying about on a saucer in the kitchen." This confirmed Miss Marple's own observation from the previous evening. "Did you mention this to Inspector Slack?" "I tried to, but he brushed it aside. Said it was probably just something Vera had put down and forgotten about." Mavis's voice carried a note of frustration. "But Miss Marple, Vera doesn't smoke. She's very particular about it, always saying it's a common habit, not suitable for a lady in her position." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. "Yet you found a cigarette stub in the clothes peg." Mavis nodded eagerly. "That's just it. When I went back to clear the hatch area this morning, before the place was properly cleaned, you understand? The saucer was still there, tucked behind the flower bin, and there was a cigarette end clipped in the peg, half-smoked, and, well, it smelled strange." "Strange how?" "Perfumed like, not tobacco, and nothing else, but as if someone wearing scent had held it, and the tip was stained with lipstick." "Coral color it was." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Coral, you say? That's quite a specific shade." "Vera wears coral lipstick," Mavis said quietly. "Always has ever since I've known her. Says it brings out the warmth in her complexion. But as I mentioned, she doesn't smoke. Makes quite a point of it, actually." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind, though the overall picture remained frustratingly unclear. "This saucer and cigarette, where are they now?" Mavis looked uncomfortable. "That's the problem. When I went to show them to Inspector Slack this afternoon, they were gone. Vera said she'd cleared everything away during her cleaning this morning. Threw it all out with the rubbish." "How very thorough of her," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Miss Marple," Mavis leaned forward earnestly, "there's something else about the dumbwaiter mechanism. Inspector Slack keeps saying the rope frayed, but I service that equipment myself twice a week. I oil the pulleys, check the ropes, replace anything that shows wear. That holding rope was sound as a bell 3 days ago." "You're certain of that?" "Absolutely certain. More than that, the rope that supposedly frayed wasn't even the main support. It was just a little slip loop I'd rigged to hold the car steady when it wasn't in use. I made it myself with some good kitchen twine, finished it off proper with a whipping knot. It would have held a man's weight easily." Miss Marple considered this information carefully. In her experience, people who worked with their hands, gardeners, cooks, craftsmen, developed an intimate knowledge of their tools and materials. If Mavis said the rope was sound, it very likely was. "You mentioned a whipping knot. That's rather skilled work for a cook." Mavis smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of pleasure Miss Marple had seen from her since the tragedy. "My late husband was a sailor, Miss Marple. Merchant Navy. He taught me all sorts of useful knots before he passed. Came in handy in kitchen work more than you'd think." "I'm sure it did." "Tell me, have you spoken to anyone else about these concerns?" "Only Paul Cartwright, and he told me not to go stirring up trouble. Said the inspector knew his business, and we should all just put the whole sorry mess behind us." Mavis's voice carried a note of bitterness. "Easy enough for him to say. He wasn't the one who found the poor man." Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, retrieving a small notebook. "Mavis, would you mind very much describing exactly what you observed yesterday evening? Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." For the next quarter hour, Mavis provided a careful account of the evening's events. She had been washing up the soup tureens in the scullery when she heard what she described as a sort of creaking sound, like old wood under strain. This had been followed almost immediately by a crash and the sound of something heavy hitting the stone floor. "I ran to see what had happened, and there was Mr. Nash at the bottom of the shaft. The dumb waiter car was down as well, resting just above him. But Miss Marple, here's what struck me as odd. There was a smell in the air that didn't belong." "What sort of smell?" "Lavender, like the hair oil Vera uses. It was quite distinct, hanging around the shaft opening, but Vera was upstairs during the interval, serving tea and managing the refreshments." Miss Marple made careful notes of this account, particularly the timing and the mysterious scent. "One more question, my dear. During the interval, did you have occasion to go near the service hatch yourself?" "Only once, to send up a fresh pot of tea. That would have been about 5 minutes before 9, I should think. And that's when I noticed the saucer with the peg wasn't there yet. I remember thinking the windowsill looked properly tidy for once." This timeline was crucial, Miss Marple realized. If the saucer had appeared between 5 minutes before 9 and the discovery of Nash's body at 9:10, it suggested deliberate placement rather than casual abandonment. After Mavis had left, promising to report any further irregularities she might observe, Miss Marple sat in her garden reviewing her notes. The evidence was becoming increasingly compelling that Percy Nash had not died as the result of a simple mechanical failure. Someone had used a cigarette, possibly as a timing device, in connection with the dumbwaiter mechanism. Someone who wore coral lipstick and lavender hair oil, but who publicly eschewed smoking. Someone who had access to the kitchen and knowledge of the building's routines. The method was beginning to suggest itself, though Miss Marple was reluctant to jump to conclusions without more definitive proof. But the pattern was unmistakable. This had been murder, carefully planned and cleverly executed to appear accidental. The question now was not whether Vera Cartwright had killed Percy Nash, but how she had managed it, and whether Miss Marple could prove it before Inspector Slack's hasty closure of the case made justice impossible. Chapter 5. 2 orders. 1 bell. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Mrs. Nora Pike, the village postmistress. Mrs. Pike was a woman of military bearing and sharp intelligence, qualities that had served her well in her dual role as keeper of the postal service and unofficial chronicler of village affairs. "Miss Marple," she announced without preamble, settling her sturdy frame into the proffered chair. "I've come about this business at the Blue Boar. There's something not quite right about the official version of events, and I believe you may be the only person in the village with both the wit and the inclination to get to the bottom of it." Miss Marple set aside her morning correspondence with interest. "Indeed. What has troubled you about Inspector Slack's conclusions?" Mrs. Pike extracted a small notebook from her handbag, the same type she used for recording postal irregularities and other matters requiring official attention. "It's about the soup order for the chairman's table. I was managing the raffle tickets during the interval, positioned where I could observe both the refreshment area and the service arrangements." She consulted her notebook with the precision of long practice. "At approximately 8:57, the Reverend Clement's wife approached me requesting soup for the chairman's table. She said the Reverend had specifically asked for it, as he was feeling rather piqued from the evening's exertions." "That seems perfectly ordinary," Miss Marple observed. "Indeed, it would be, except for what happened 3 minutes later. A young lad, Tommy Prescott, I believe, came to me with the same request, said Mrs. Cartwright had sent him to ask for soup for the chairman's table." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. 2 requests for the same order. Precisely. And here's what struck me as particularly odd. When I pointed out that Mrs. Clement had already made the request, the boy seemed genuinely confused. Said Mrs. Cartwright had been most insistent that he deliver the message immediately. This information cast the evening's events in an entirely new light. Miss Marple leaned forward with keen interest. "Did you observe Mrs. Cartwright's location when she supposedly sent the boy?" "That's just it. She was nowhere to be seen at the time. I had a clear view of the entire refreshment area and she wasn't there. Yet Tommy was quite certain about his instructions." Mrs. Pike turned a page in her notebook. "There's more. The service bell by the dumb waiter hatch rang twice during those few minutes. Once when Mrs. Clement made her request, which would be normal procedure to alert the kitchen, but then again about 2 minutes later, though no additional orders had been placed." Miss Marple considered this carefully. In her experience, duplicate orders and mysterious bell signals were rarely coincidental in cases of suspicious death. "Did you happen to notice the order slate that evening?" "I did indeed. Mrs. Cartwright was most particular about maintaining proper records, but when I glanced at it later, I noticed something peculiar. The entry for soup chair appeared to have been written twice, once in what looked like the original writing and again over what seemed to be an eraser. The pattern was becoming clearer to Miss Marple, though the precise mechanism remained elusive. You mentioned observing the refreshment area carefully. Did you notice anything else unusual about Mrs. Cartwright's behavior that evening?" Mrs. Pike's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, she did seem rather more animated than usual, constantly moving about, checking on this and that, and she made several trips downstairs, which struck me as odd since the kitchen staff were perfectly capable of managing their duties." "At what times were these trips downstairs?" "Let me see." Mrs. Pike consulted her notebook again. "Once at about 8:45, just after the interval began, then again at 8:55, just before the confusion about the soup orders, and finally at about 9:05, shortly before that poor man was discovered." The timing was significant, Miss Marple realized. If her growing theory was correct, Vera Cartwright had needed to be downstairs at precisely the right moments to set her plan in motion. "Mrs. Pike, you mentioned that Mrs. Cartwright seemed insistent about the second soup order. Did you observe her demeanor when she realized there had been a duplication?" "That's what was so peculiar. She didn't seem surprised at all. In fact, she appeared almost satisfied, as if the confusion had been exactly what she expected. Miss Marple made a mental note of this observation. In her experience, murderers often reveal themselves through such small betrayals of their supposed surprise at events they had actually orchestrated. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Pike continued, lowering her voice slightly. "When the body was discovered and we all rushed downstairs, I happened to notice the order slate again. The duplicate entry had been completely erased, leaving only the original soup chair notation. This detail provided another piece of the puzzle. Someone had taken care to eliminate evidence of the duplicate order, suggesting premeditation and a desire to cover tracks." After Mrs. Pike departed, Miss Marple found herself with a much clearer picture of the evening's events. The duplicate soup orders weren't confusion. They were part of an elaborate timing mechanism. One order to establish legitimacy, the second to ensure that Percy Nash would be at the dumb waiter hatch at precisely the right moment. Lady Bantry arrived for their usual morning coffee just as Miss Marple was reviewing her notes. "Jane, you look positively absorbed. Have you uncovered something significant?" Miss Marple shared Mrs. Pike's information, watching as comprehension dawned on her friend's face. "Good heavens," Lady Bantry exclaimed. "You mean Vera deliberately lured Nash to the hatch?" "I believe so, yes. But the question remains, how did she ensure the dumbwaiter car would descend at exactly the right moment? Even if she had tampered with the rope mechanism, she couldn't have controlled the precise timing from upstairs." Lady Bantry frowned. "Unless she had some sort of delayed mechanism, something that would act after a predetermined interval." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The cigarette stub with its distinctive coral lipstick stain was beginning to make perfect sense. Not as evidence of smoking, but as a timing device, a fuse essentially, designed to burn through at a predictable rate. "Dolly, I believe we need to conduct a small experiment. Do you happen to know if Vera Cartwright is particular about the brand of cigarettes sold at the Blue Boar?" "Oddly enough, I do. She's quite proud of stocking only the finest tobacco. Virginia brand, I believe, because they burn evenly and don't leave an unpleasant odor in the public rooms." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Evenly burning cigarettes. Yes, that would be essential for timing purposes. And if one were to treat the tobacco with a small amount of hair oil, it would burn more slowly and predictably." Lady Bantry finished catching her friend's train of thought. "Jane, you're suggesting she used a cigarette as a timer. I'm suggesting that someone with knowledge of both the building's routines and the burning properties of tobacco might have devised a very clever method of ensuring that a mechanical failure occurred at precisely the moment when her victim was in the most vulnerable position." The method was becoming clear, but Miss Marple knew that understanding how a crime was committed was only part of the puzzle. She still needed to determine exactly how the timing device had been connected to the dumbwaiter mechanism. And more importantly, she needed evidence that would convince Inspector Slack to reconsider his hasty conclusion. But with each passing hour, the case against accidental death grew stronger, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly confident that justice for Percy Nash was within reach. Chapter 6. The Rope That Wouldn't Fray. The afternoon found Miss Marple in conversation with Len Bidd, the Blue Boar's cellar man, whom she had encountered quite by chance while walking past the inn. He was seated on an upturned crate behind the building, enjoying what appeared to be his fourth cigarette of the hour. His long fingers stained their customary yellow from years of heavy smoking. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap respectfully as she approached. "Poor old Nash. Can't say I like the fellow much, but nobody deserves to go like that." Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire the inn's well-tended herb garden, but actually to engage the man in conversation. In her experience, those who worked behind the scenes often observed details that escaped more prominent witnesses. Indeed, it was shocking, Mr. Bid. I understand you were among the first to discover what had happened. Len nodded, taking a deep draw from his woodbine. Heard Mavis scream, didn't I? Came running from the cellar where I'd been checking the beer lines. Saw Nash lying there, poor devil, with the dumb waiter car settled right above him. You know the building's mechanisms well, I suppose, having worked here so long. 23 years come Michaelmas, Len said with evident pride. Know every creak and groan of the old place. That's why what happened don't make sense to me. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. In what way? Len stubbed out his cigarette and immediately reached for another. Well, it's like this, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack keeps saying the holding rope frayed through, but I checked that very mechanism not 3 days past. Regular maintenance, you understand? Paul's very particular about keeping everything shipshape. He lit his fresh cigarette and continued. The rope that supposedly broke, it weren't even the main support cable. That's thick as your thumb and sound as a bell. What broke was just a little slip loop that Mavis had rigged up to keep the car steady when it wasn't being used. A slip loop? A clever bit of work. It was. She'd taken a length of good kitchen twine, made it into a proper holding loop with a neat whipping to finish it off. Sailor's work. That was her late husband taught her well. That loop would have held my weight and more. Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. But Inspector Slack believes it simply frayed through. Len snorted derisively. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but that's nonsense. Good hemp twine doesn't just fray through like that. Not when it's properly whipped and under light strain. Besides, I examined what was left of it this morning before the inspector had it cleared away. And what did you find? The standing part of the rope was perfect. Showed normal wear. But nothing dangerous but the bit that's supposedly frayed. Len paused, seeming to search for the right words. Miss Marple, that end wasn't frayed at all. It was burned through, clean as you please. This confirmation of her suspicion sent a thrill of vindication through Miss Marple. Burned, you say? And more than that, there was a film of something oily on the fibers near the break. Smelled familiar, it did, though I couldn't place it at first. Then it came to me. Lavender, like that hair oil Vera uses. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. You're quite certain about the oil? Len nodded emphatically. 23 years of handling rope and twine, you learn to notice things like that. Oil makes hemp burn different, slower, and more controlled, like. Someone had treated that twine deliberate. The picture was becoming crystal clear now. Vera had prepared the timing mechanism with meticulous care, using her hair oil to ensure the treated twine would burn at a predictable rate. But Miss Marple needed to understand the complete mechanism. Mr. Bid, could you show me exactly how this holding loop was arranged? Len glanced around nervously. Well, I suppose there'd be no harm in it, seeing as how the inspector's finished with his examination. He led her into the kitchen, where the dumb waiter shaft stood silent and secured. The mechanism itself was elegantly simple, a system of pulley and counterweights that had served the inn faithfully for decades. See here, Len explained, pointing to a small screw eye mounted beside the hatch. Mavis had run her holding line from the car's brake lever round this pulley here and made it off to that screw eye with a proper slip knot. Simple and effective. And when the line was cut, burned through, what would have happened? Car would have come down smooth as silk. No noise except maybe a bit of creaking from the pulleys. Person standing at the hatch wouldn't have heard it coming until too late. Miss Marple studied the arrangement carefully. How long would it have taken for a treated piece of twine to burn through, do you think? Len considered this. Depending on the thickness and how much oil was used, 5 to 10 minutes. I'd reckon long enough for someone to be well clear of the area when it happened. The timing fitted perfectly with the sequence of events Mrs. Pike had described. Vera could have set her device in motion during one of her trips downstairs, then returned upstairs to establish her alibi before sending the duplicate soup order to lure Nash to the fatal position. "There's something else peculiar," Len continued, warming to his subject. "That little screw eye where the line was made off. It's been cleaned recently, polished bright as a new penny. But the rest of the metalwork shows normal wear and tarnish, as if someone had been particularly concerned to remove any traces of evidence from that specific location." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "So, Mr. Bidd, if you ask me, that's not the behavior of someone who's got nothing to hide." After thanking Len for his invaluable insights, Miss Marple made her way home with a sense of growing certainty about the case. The method was now clear in every detail. Vera had prepared a slow-burning fuse using kitchen twine treated with her lavender hair oil. This had been attached to the holding loop that kept the dumbwaiter car in its raised position. The cigarette with its coral lipstick stain hadn't been discarded carelessly. It had been the ignition source, left smoldering in the clothes, pegged to burn down at a predictable rate until it reached and ignited the treated twine. The duplicate soup orders had ensured Nash would be examining the hatch at exactly the right moment, and the scent of lavender that lingered in the shaft was the final proof of Vera's presence at the scene. It was, Miss Marple had to admit, an extraordinarily clever scheme. Under normal circumstances, Nash's death would have been accepted as a tragic accident, the result of an aging building's mechanical failure. Only the most careful observation of small details had revealed the truth. But now came the difficult part, convincing Inspector Slack to reopen what he considered a closed case and proving beyond doubt that Vera Cartwright had committed deliberate murder. Miss Marple suspected that would require more than theoretical deduction. It would demand practical demonstration of how the crime had been accomplished. Chapter 7. Lavender on the Butt. Miss Marple's investigation had reached the point where circumstantial evidence pointed unmistakably toward Vera Cartwright. But she knew that Inspector Slack would require more concrete proof before abandoning his comfortable theory of accidental death. With this in mind, she resolved to make one final visit to the Blue Boar, ostensibly for the purpose of returning a recipe book she had borrowed from Mavis some weeks earlier. The timing of her visit was carefully calculated. The early evening hours found the inn between its afternoon quiet and the evening rush, when staff would be preparing for the dinner service, but not yet fully occupied with customers. She found Vera in the bar polishing glasses with her characteristic methodical precision. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to return Mavis's book," Vera said, accepting the volume with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's been asking about her collection of pudding recipes." "I do hope she's recovering well from the shock of recent events," Miss Marple replied, settling herself on one of the bar stools. "Such a dreadful experience for a sensitive person." "Oh, Mavis is made of stern stuff," Vera said, continuing her polishing with perhaps unnecessary vigor. "We all are in this business. One learns to cope with unexpected difficulties." Miss Marple observed the bar's appointments with interest. Behind Vera, on the shelf that held various personal items, stood a small compact case in tortoiseshell. Beside it was a bottle of what was unmistakably hair preparation, its lavender scent detectable even at a distance. "What a lovely shade of lipstick you wear," Miss Marple commented conversationally. "Coral is so flattering to your complexion." Vera's hand moved unconsciously to the compact. "Thank you. I've used the same shade for years. One finds what suits and sticks to it, doesn't one?" "Indeed, one does, though I must confess, I've never been able to manage cosmetics properly. My late husband always said I made rather a hash of it." Miss Marple smiled deprecatingly. "May I ask where you purchased such a perfect shade?" "Brompton's in the county town," Vera replied, her polishing becoming more energetic. "They stock a very good selection of quality preparations." Miss Marple nodded appreciatively. then allowed her gaze to drift around the room. I do admire how you maintain such high standards in every aspect of the establishment. The cleaning yesterday morning, for instance. Everything was spotless despite the unfortunate circumstances. One cannot allow standards to slip even in times of crisis, Vera said stiffly. The Blue Boar has a reputation to maintain. Of course, though I imagine it must have been quite a task cleaning up after such disruption. All those investigators tramping about disturbing your usual order. Vera's movements became slightly jerky. Well, one does what one must. I rose early and set everything to rights. The kitchen particularly required thorough attention. Miss Marple's keen eyes had been making a careful inventory of the bar area. On a small table near the window, she spotted what appeared to be a packet of safety matches, the sort used for lighting gas rings and oil lamps. More significantly, beside Paul Cartwright's chair was an ashtray containing several cigarette ends, but these were clearly woodbines, the unfiltered variety that Len Bid favored. I don't smoke myself, Miss Marple said conversationally. But I've always been curious about the different brands. My nephew tells me some burn more evenly than others. Vera's polishing ceased entirely. I wouldn't know about such things. As I've mentioned before, I consider smoking a rather common habit. Oh, quite right, Miss Marple agreed warmly. Though I suppose in the licensed trade one must stock quality tobacco for one's customers. I noticed you carry Virginia brand cigarettes. Rather expensive, aren't they? Paul insists on quality in all our stock, Vera replied, her voice carrying a slight tremor. He says cheap tobacco leaves an unpleasant odor in the public rooms. Miss Marple nodded understandingly, then rose as if to take her leave. I should let you get on with your preparations for the evening service. Oh, but before I go, Mavis mentioned that some of her kitchen implements had gone missing during the confusion yesterday. A clothes peg, I believe, and a small saucer. Such odd things to misplace, don't you think? Vera's face had gone quite pale. I cleared everything away that seemed out of place. One cannot have odd bits and pieces cluttering up a working kitchen. Of course not. Though I confess myself curious about why a clothes peg should have been in the kitchen at all. Rather an unusual location for such an item. I believe it may have fallen from someone's apron pocket, Vera stammered. These things happen in a busy establishment. Miss Marple smiled benignly. Indeed they do. Well, I mustn't keep you any longer. As she made her way toward the door, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something that made her pause. In the wastebasket beside the bar, partially concealed beneath the other refuse, was what appeared to be a small white saucer, the same size and pattern as the one Mavis had described finding by the flour bin. Oh dear, Miss Marple exclaimed, pointing toward the basket. I believe you may have accidentally discarded something valuable. Is that not one of your best china saucers? Vera's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed crimson, and she moved quickly to block Miss Marple's view of the wastebasket. It's nothing important, just a cracked piece that needed disposing of. But Miss Marple had seen enough. The saucer bore the unmistakable brown stain of tobacco ash, and clinging to its rim was a tiny fragment of what looked very much like coral-colored material. How careless of me to notice, Miss Marple said mildly. I do hope I haven't caused you any inconvenience. Not at all, Vera replied, though her voice shook slightly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really must get on with the evening preparations. Miss Marple took her leave, but not before making one final observation. As she passed through the kitchen on her way to the rear exit, she noticed Mavis's apron hanging on its usual hook. The fabric showed the normal stains of kitchen work, flour, a bit of gravy, and on the hem a small smudge of what appeared to be soot from the range. However, there was no trace of the telltale coral, lipstick that would have been present if Mavis had handled the cigarette that served as the timing device. The absence of this Evidence was as significant as its presence would have been outside in the inn yard. Miss Marple found herself face to face with Paul Cartwright, who was checking the beer barrels with his usual boisterous energy. "Miss Marple," he boomed, "kind of you to look in on us. Difficult times these, but we're bearing up well enough." "I'm sure you are, Mr. Cartwright. You and your wife seem to manage challenges with admirable efficiency." Paul's expression sobered slightly. "Vera's been taking things hard, truth be told. Always was one to worry about the reputation of the house. This business with Nash has her quite upset. Understandably so. Such an unfortunate accident could reflect poorly on an establishment, regardless of the actual circumstances." "Exactly so," Paul agreed vigorously. "Though between you and me, Miss Marple, Nash brought it on himself, always poking his nose where it wasn't wanted, looking for trouble where none existed." Miss Marple studied the landlord's florid face carefully. "You didn't care for him, then?" Paul's laugh was hearty, but held a note of bitterness. "Care for him? The man was a menace to every publican in the county, always threatening to find some minor infraction that would cost a fortune in fines, or worse, closure. But that's neither here nor there now, is it? Poor devil's gone, and we must all make the best of it." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the day's discoveries. The physical evidence, the saucer with its tobacco stains, the coral lipstick traces, the lavender-scented hair oil readily available in the bar, all pointed toward Vera Cartwright's involvement in Nash's death. More telling still were the psychological indicators, Vera's nervous behavior when questioned about the missing items, her defensive attitude about the thoroughness of her cleaning, and her obvious anxiety whenever the conversation touched on the details of the tragedy. The method was now completely clear in Miss Marple's mind. Vera had prepared her timing device with meticulous care, using materials readily available in the inn. The cigarette, treated with hair oil and bearing the telltale mark of her coral lipstick, had been placed in the clothes peg to burn down at a predictable rate. When the flame reached the treated twine, it had burned through the holding loop, causing the dumbwaiter car to descend just as Nash leaned in to investigate the duplicate soup order. It was, Miss Marple had to admit, a remarkably clever scheme. Under normal circumstances, the evidence would have been destroyed by the fire itself, leaving only the appearance of mechanical failure. Only the murderer's compulsive tidiness had preserved the crucial clues long enough for them to be discovered. Now came the most difficult task of all, convincing Inspector Slack to look beyond his hasty conclusion and consider the possibility that Percy Nash had been deliberately murdered by someone whose motive was as compelling as her method was ingenious. Chapter 8. Ticket Time and Alibis. The morning after her revealing visit to the Blue Boar found Miss Marple in her sitting room, methodically reviewing her notes while awaiting the arrival of Inspector Slack. She had sent word requesting his presence, suggesting that certain irregularities in the Nash case warranted his attention. To her mild surprise, he had agreed to call, though his message had carried a distinctly skeptical tone. When he arrived precisely at 10 bind, his manner was brisk and somewhat impatient. Inspector Slack was a man who disliked having his conclusions questioned, particularly by elderly ladies with, as he saw it, too much time on their hands and too great a fondness for sensational explanations. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting her offer of tea with visible reluctance, "I understand you have concerns about the Nash incident, though I must say, the case seems perfectly straightforward to me." "Indeed, Inspector, and I'm sure your initial assessment was based on sound professional judgment. However, certain small details have come to my attention that might warrant further consideration." Miss Marple arranged her teacups with particular care, using the ritual to organize her thoughts. I wonder if you might indulge me by reviewing the timeline of events on the evening in question. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with an air of patient resignation. Nash arrived at the Blue Boar at approximately 7:30. The whist drive commenced at 8 with an interval beginning around 8:45. Nash was discovered, dead at the bottom of the dumbwaiter shaft at 9:10. Death resulted from mechanical failure, a frayed rope causing the car to descend unexpectedly. And the alibis of the principal parties? Paul Cartwright was in the public bar throughout the evening, witnessed by numerous customers. Mavis Reed was in the kitchen and scullery preparing and serving the interval refreshments. Vera Cartwright was upstairs managing the refreshment arrangements and assisting with the whist drive organization. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. All perfectly reasonable, though I wonder if you might have overlooked certain complications in Mrs. Cartwright's movements that evening. She reached for a small notebook of her own. Mrs. Pike, the postmistress, kept rather careful records of the raffle ticket sales during the interval. According to her notes, she sold Mrs. Cartwright 2 raffle tickets at 8:50, just as the refreshments were being served. Inspector Slack frowned. I fail to see the significance of that detail. The significance, Inspector, lies in what Mrs. Pike observed immediately afterward. She noticed a distinct ink blot on Mrs. Cartwright's tickets, suggesting they were written hastily. More importantly, Mrs. Pike distinctly recalls Mrs. Cartwright claiming she had been upstairs the entire interval when questioned about her whereabouts. Miss Marple turned a page in her notebook. Yet, according to multiple witnesses, including Mrs. Pike herself, Mrs. Cartwright made at least 3 separate trips downstairs during that crucial 20-minute period. Once at 8:45, again at 8:55, and finally at 9:05, just minutes before the tragedy occurred. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. People's recollections of timing can be notoriously unreliable, particularly during stressful situations. Quite so. However, Mrs. Pike's observations are supported by physical evidence. The service bell beside the dumb waiter hatch was rung twice during the interval, once for the legitimate soup order from Mrs. Clement, and again approximately 2 minutes later, though no additional orders had been placed upstairs. Miss Marple paused to pour fresh tea, allowing this information to settle. Furthermore, the order slate showed clear evidence of having been written on twice. The entry for soup chair appeared to have been erased and rewritten, though Mrs. Pike observed only one legitimate request for soup at the chairman's table. Inspector Slack was beginning to look less comfortable with his simple explanation. Even assuming these observations are accurate, they hardly constitute evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. Perhaps not individually, Miss Marple agreed mildly. However, when considered alongside certain physical evidence that has come to light, they begin to form a rather different picture of the evening's events. She reached into her handbag and produced a small wrapped package. Inspector, I wonder if you had examined this item with your professional expertise. The package contained the saucer she had retrieved from the Blue Boar's wastebasket, carefully wrapped to preserve any remaining evidence. The tobacco stains were still visible, as was the fragment of coral-colored material clinging to the rim. Where did you obtain this? Inspector Slack demanded, his professional interest finally aroused. From the refuse at the Blue Boar, where it had been hastily discarded during yesterday morning's unusually thorough cleaning. You will observe the tobacco ash residue and what appears to be lipstick staining on the rim. Inspector, Mrs. Cartwright is well known for her use of coral lipstick. Brompton's in the county town stocks it specially for her. She also uses lavender hair oil, a bottle of which sits prominently on the shelf behind the Blue Boar's bar. But Mrs. Cartwright doesn't smoke, Inspector Slack objected, though his tone was becoming less certain. Indeed, she does not, which makes the presence of her lipstick on a cigarette rather significant. Wouldn't you say, particularly when that cigarette appears to have been used as some sort of timing device? Miss Marple proceeded to outline her theory of the murder method, explaining how the cigarette could have served as a fuse to burn through the treated twine holding the dumbwaiter car. Inspector Slack listened with growing skepticism that gradually transformed into professional interest. The timing would have been crucial, Miss Marple explained. Mrs. Cartwright needed to set her device in motion, return upstairs to establish her presence at the raffle table, then ensure that Mr. Nash was at the hatch when the mechanism activated. The duplicate soup order served this purpose perfectly. Inspector Slack was taking notes now, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by careful attention. You're suggesting this was all carefully planned. I'm suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of the inn's routines and access to its facilities devised a method to eliminate Mr. Nash while making his death appear accidental. The evidence points quite clearly to Mrs. Cartwright, though I recognize that much of it is circumstantial. What motive would she have had? Miss Marple's expression grew grave. Mr. Nash was known for his zealous enforcement of licensing regulations. His threat during the evening that certain houses would smart after his visit was hardly subtle. I suspect that closer examination of the Blue Boar's records might reveal irregularities that would have provided him with grounds for serious action against the establishment. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Miss Marple, I believe this matter warrants further investigation, though I must say proving deliberate murder will require more than circumstantial evidence and theoretical reconstructions. Miss Marple smiled gently. Indeed it will, Inspector. Which is why I believe a practical demonstration of the method might prove illuminating. After all, if the technique worked once, it should be possible to show how it was accomplished. The prospect of such a demonstration clearly intrigued Inspector Slack, despite his natural caution. You're proposing to recreate the crime. I'm proposing to test whether the method I've described is actually feasible. If it proves workable, we shall have strong evidence to support a murder charge. If not, we can return to your original theory of accidental death with clear consciences. Inspector Slack considered this proposal carefully. The case had already generated some criticism from his superiors, who felt that important evidence might have been overlooked in his haste to close the matter. A thorough reinvestigation, particularly one that either confirmed his original conclusions or revealed genuine criminal activity, could only enhance his professional reputation. Very well, Miss Marple. I propose we conduct this experiment tomorrow evening, when the inn is closed to normal business. If your theory proves correct, we'll proceed with formal charges. If not, the matter ends there. Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. That seems eminently reasonable, Inspector. Though I should warn you, if I'm correct about Mrs. Cartwright's guilt, she may prove rather desperate when confronted with the evidence. Chapter 9. The Cook's Knot. The following afternoon brought Inspector Slack to the Blue Boar with a small party of witnesses, including Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, and Dr. Haydock. The inn had been closed to regular business for the demonstration, lending the familiar building an oddly solemn atmosphere. Paul Cartwright met them at the door, his usual bonhomie replaced by nervous uncertainty. Inspector, I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish by this recreation. Surely the matter has been settled. Nothing has been settled definitively, Mr. Cartwright, Inspector Slack replied with professional firmness. Miss Marple has raised certain questions that require thorough investigation. Vera Cartwright appeared from the kitchen, her face pale but composed. She wore her customary coral lipstick, and her hair showed the telltale sheen of lavender oil, details that Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction. Before we begin, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if I might ask Mavis to demonstrate her skill with knots. It would help us understand the original mechanism that supposedly failed. Mavis Reed, looking puzzled but willing, accepted a length of kitchen twine from Inspector Slack's supplies. "What sort of knot would you like me to tie, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps the sort you might use to secure a joint of meat for roasting. Something that would hold firm under weight, but could be released quickly if needed." Without hesitation, Mavis created what she called a slip loop with a clove hitch, finishing it with a neat whipping knot to prevent the end from fraying. Her movements were sure and practiced, the result of skills learned long ago from her sailor husband. "Excellent work," Miss Marple observed. "Now, Inspector, if you would examine the dumbwaiter mechanism, you'll see evidence of exactly this type of knot work." Inspector Slack studied the rigging carefully, comparing it to Mavis's demonstration. The similarity was unmistakable. The same precise technique, the same attention to detail in the finishing touches. "However," Miss Marple continued, "there's something curious about the rope that allegedly frayed. Mavis, would you examine what remains of it?" Mavis handled the severed rope with professional interest. "This is my work. Certainly, I recognize my own whipping technique." "But, Inspector," she looked up with growing concern, "this end hasn't frayed naturally. Someone's treated this rope with oil. I can still smell it faintly, and it's been burned through, not pulled apart." Vera's face had gone white. "That's absurd. Why would anyone deliberately damage the equipment?" Miss Marple turned to address her directly. "Perhaps because someone needed the rope to part at a specific time. Mrs. Cartwright, someone who understood that oil would make hemp burn more slowly and predictably." "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Vera replied, but her voice trembled slightly. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said calmly, "that you used a cigarette as a timing device, a cigarette bearing your distinctive coral lipstick, and treated with your lavender hair oil to control the burning rate." Inspector Slack had been examining the area near the flour bin during this exchange. "Miss Marple, I believe I found something relevant." He held up a small fragment of fabric, coral-colored and bearing the distinctive texture of lipstick. It had been caught on the rough edge of the flour bin, presumably torn from the cigarette when the evidence was hastily disposed of. "This matches the residue found on the saucer you recovered," he observed. "The color is identical to Mrs. Cartwright's lipstick." Vera's composure was beginning to crack. "You can't prove anything from scraps of whatever that is. People use all sorts of cosmetics." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Quite true. However, there's also the matter of the scented oil found on the rope fibers. Len Bidd, who has handled rope for 23 years, identified it specifically as lavender, the same fragrance you use in your hair preparation." Dr. Haydock had been examining Mavis's apron during these exchanges. "Miss Marple, you mentioned something about distinguishing between different types of stains. I noticed Mavis's apron shows various marks from her kitchen work. Indeed, flour, gravy, and soot from the range. Exactly what one would expect from someone engaged in honest cooking, but no trace of coral lipstick, which would certainly have been present if she had handled the cigarette used as a timing device." Vera's cuff, however, Dr. Haydock continued, showed a different story. A tiny smear of the same coral shade was visible where it had apparently brushed against the treated cigarette, along with a faint film of the oily residue that had facilitated the controlled burning. "The evidence is quite compelling, Mrs. Cartwright," Inspector Slack said formally. "The lipstick traces, the scented oil, your presence in the kitchen at the crucial times, and your obvious familiarity with the building's routines all point to your involvement in Mr. Nash's death." "It was an accident," Vera burst out, her careful composure finally cracking completely. "I never meant for him to be killed. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him think the building was unsafe so he'd leave us alone." "Vera, what are you saying?" Paul Cartwright stared at his wife in horror. "He was going to ruin us," she cried. "All those threats about inspections and violations. I knew he'd find something. He always did. the Blue Boar would have been closed. And then what would we have done? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but inexorable. So you devised a plan to create what appeared to be a mechanical failure. You prepared the timing device with meticulous care, using your cigarette as a fuse and your hair oil to control the burning rate. I thought the car would just come down and maybe give him a fright, Vera whispered. I never imagined he would lean so far into the shaft. When I heard Mavis scream, you realized your carefully planned accident had become actual murder? Inspector Slack concluded grimly. Vera nodded miserably. I tried to clean up the evidence, but there was so much. The saucer, the cigarette end, the oil on the rope. I thought I'd gotten rid of everything. Your thoroughness in cleaning actually preserved some of the evidence, Miss Marple observed. If you had been less meticulous, the traces might have been overlooked entirely. Dr. Haydock shook his head sadly. All this to avoid a licensing inspection. Was it really worth destroying so many lives? He would have ruined us, Vera repeated. But her voice had lost all conviction. 23 years we've built this business up. I couldn't let him destroy it all for some petty regulation. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his handcuffs. Vera Cartwright, I'm arresting you for the murder of Percy Nash. You're not obliged to say anything. But anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. As they led Vera away, Paul Cartwright stood in his empty inn, looking suddenly aged and broken. I never suspected, he said to no one in particular. All these years, I never knew what she was capable of. Miss Marple gathered her things quietly, feeling no satisfaction in the resolution of the case. Another tragedy born of fear and desperation, another life destroyed by the belief that murder could solve problems that honest action could not. Come along, Dolly, she said softly to Lady Bantry. I think we've seen quite enough for one day. As they walked back through the village, Lady Bantry was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. Jane, how did you know it was Vera and not someone else? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. The knots, my dear. Mavis tied that slip loop exactly as her husband had taught her, with pride and precision. But someone had used her honest work as part of a deception. The coral lipstick and lavender oil were simply confirmation of what the rope work had already told me. Chapter 10. Blue Boar Cellar. The Wait That Waited. A week had passed since Vera Cartwright's arrest, and the Blue Boar stood shuttered and silent, its future uncertain, pending the resolution of legal proceedings. Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the scene one final time, accompanied by Lady Bantry and Inspector Slack, who wished to complete his official reconstruction of the crime for the court records. The cellar beneath the inn was cool and dim, lit only by electric bulbs that cast harsh shadows among the beer barrels and storage shelves. It was here Inspector Slack had decided that the final demonstration should take place, away from curious eyes and in the very foundations of the building where the tragedy had unfolded. I confess, Inspector Slack said, consulting his notes by the light of a hand torch, that I'm still not entirely clear on the mechanical aspects of Mrs. Cartwright's method. The principle seemed sound enough, but the execution required considerable precision. Miss Marple moved carefully among the cellar's contents, her keen eyes taking in the structural details that supported her theory. The beauty of the scheme, Inspector, lay in its apparent simplicity. Vera needed only common household items and a working knowledge of timing. She paused beside a wooden support post that rose from the cellar floor to the kitchen above. The dumbwaiter shaft runs directly overhead, supported by this framework. Any vibration or movement in the mechanism would be transmitted through these timbers. Lady Bantry, who had been examining the cellar's appointments with curiosity, looked up from a collection of wine bottles. Jane, surely the most difficult aspect would have been calculating the timing. How could Vera be certain the mechanism would activate at precisely the right moment? That, Dolly, was where her knowledge of the building's routines proved crucial. She understood that the interval lasted exactly 20 minutes, that the soup order would bring Nash to investigate the hatch, and that Virginia cigarettes burn at a predictable rate when treated with hair oil. Miss Marple moved to stand directly beneath the kitchen area. The sequence was carefully orchestrated. During her first trip downstairs at 8:45, she prepared the timing device and set it in motion. The cigarette, treated with lavender oil and held in the clothes peg beside the treated twine, would burn for approximately 15 minutes before reaching the rope. Inspector Slack nodded, following her reasoning, which would bring the activation time to 9 QAU, exactly when she sent the duplicate soup order to lure Nash to the hatch. Precisely. But the true elegance of the plan lay in the weight distribution. Miss Marple indicated the ceiling above them. The dumbwaiter car, when raised to its highest position, represented a considerable mass held in check only by Mavis's slipknot. When that restraint was burned through, physics took over. She gestured toward the support beams. The descending car would have created vibrations throughout the building structure. Anyone in the cellar would have felt the impact, heard the crash above. The sound would have been muffled by the intervening floors, making it difficult to pinpoint the exact source immediately. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them for the final reconstruction, examined the structural elements with professional interest. The head injury pattern makes perfect sense now. Nash would have been struck by the descending car, then pitched forward into the shaft. The skull fracture was consistent with both impacts. "What I find most chilling," Lady Bantry observed, "is the cold calculation involved. Vera planned Nash's death with the same methodical precision she applied to running the inn." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "I suspect, Dolly, that Vera convinced herself it would merely be a warning, a mechanical failure that would frighten Nash into abandoning his inspection. The human capacity for self-deception is quite remarkable when faced with desperate circumstances." Inspector Slack was making detailed notes of the reconstruction. "For the court records, Miss Marple, could you outline the complete sequence of events as you understand them?" Miss Marple arranged her thoughts carefully. Vera's plan required her to be in 3 places at specific times. First, in the kitchen to set the timing device. Second, upstairs to establish an alibi at the raffle table. Third, back in the vicinity to send the false soup order that would position Nash at the fatal location. She moved through the cellar, her footsteps echoing softly. At 8:45, during the natural confusion of the interval, she went to the kitchen and prepared her device. The cigarette bearing her coral lipstick and treated with lavender hair oil was placed in the clothes peg beside the oiled twine that held the dumb waiter car. The timing was critical, Inspector Slack observed. Indeed, she had perhaps 2 minutes to complete the preparation before returning upstairs. At 8:50, she purchased raffle tickets from Mrs. Pike, deliberately drawing attention to her presence in the public area. The ink blot on the ticket suggests haste, but it also provided proof of her location. Miss Marple paused, gathering the threads of her narrative. For the next 10 minutes, she remained visible upstairs, participating in the social activities. But at 9:00 she made her fatal move. The duplicate soup order, delivered through young Tommy Prescott, brought Nash to examine what he believed was a jammed mechanism. Dr. Haydock shook his head grimly. He would have had no warning. The car descended silently until the moment of impact. By which time, Miss Marple concluded, Vera was back upstairs, visible to multiple witnesses. When Mavis screamed and the alarm was raised, she appeared as shocked as anyone else. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with satisfaction. The reconstruction is complete and compelling. Mrs. Cartwright's confession, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, should ensure a conviction. As they prepared to leave the cellar, Lady Bantry voiced the question that had troubled them all. Jane, do you believe Vera truly intended only to frighten Nash as she claimed? Miss Marple considered this carefully as they climbed the narrow stairs to the inn's main floor. I believe, Dolly, that Vera told herself it was merely a warning, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The precision of the timing, the care taken to position Nash at exactly the right location, the thorough preparation of the scene, these speak of deliberate murder, however much the perpetrator might wish to deny it to herself. They emerged into the abandoned kitchen, where the dumbwaiter shaft stood silent and secured. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating the scene of the tragedy with golden light that seemed oddly peaceful. What will become of the Blue Boar? Lady Bantry asked quietly. Inspector Slack shrugged. That depends on the court proceedings and Mr. Cartwright's decisions. The building itself is sound enough, despite its role in this unhappy affair. Miss Marple moved to the service hatch one final time, running her finger along the familiar wooden sill. Buildings endure, Dolly, while human dramas play out within their walls. The Blue Boar has seen joy and sorrow, celebration and tragedy. Perhaps in time it will see happiness again. As they walked back through the village in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had begun with a simple parish whist drive and ended with a carefully planned murder. The small details that had first aroused her suspicion, the singed thread, the scent of lavender, the curious saucer with its clothes peg, had ultimately revealed a complex web of deception and desperation. You know, Jane, Lady Bantry said softly, I never suspected Vera was capable of such calculation. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Fear makes people capable of extraordinary things, my dear. Not always admirable things, but extraordinary nonetheless. Vera Cartwright was a woman who had built her entire identity around the success of the Blue Boar. When that success was threatened, she chose murder over honest reckoning with her difficulties. They paused at Miss Marple's garden gate, where the evening primroses were beginning to open in the twilight. The familiar sounds of village life, dogs barking, children playing, the distant chime of the church bell, provided a comforting contrast to the afternoon's grim proceedings. Will you testify at the trial? Lady Bantry asked. If required, certainly, though I suspect Vera's confession will make extensive testimony unnecessary. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to enter her cottage. Justice will be served, Dolly, though I find no satisfaction in it. Another life destroyed by the belief that murder could solve problems that patience and honesty could not. As she closed her door against the night, Miss Marple reflected that the case was closed, but its lessons would linger. In a village where everyone knew everyone else, the revelation of such calculated deception had shaken assumptions about human nature that might never fully recover. Yet life would continue as it always did, and perhaps that was the most fitting memorial to poor Percy Nash. Not the manner of his death, but the enduring vitality of the community that would, in time, heal from the wounds his murder had inflicted.